Thank you, IFFK, for this wonderful opportunity. And hello, Andrea. Lovely to meet you virtually. It's a real shame that you couldn't be there for this festival and we couldn't meet in person, but hopefully with your next film.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be showing the film in India. I really am. I think it's wonderful. And yes, unfortunately, I cannot be there in person. I would love to, and hopefully one day I will make it.
Someday, yes. So, birdwatching unfolds a great deal like a personal documentary. Many of its narrative devices are like the ones one would see in a personal documentary. So, could you please start off by telling us what made you think that approach worked best to tell your story?
Okay, well, to answer this question, I think I'd like to start out saying that I'm a filmmaker, that I work both in the world of fiction as well as in the world of documentary. My first film was a fiction film. My second film was a documentary. And this, which is my third film, is kind of a mixture between the two. And I love both worlds, and I love the ambiguous kind of part in between that you don't quite know if it is or if it's not, and playing with those formats. Um, and with this story in particular, it has to do with how the story was born, how it came to be. Um, this film was born from a fear I had, and I continue to have to this day. My greatest fear is to have Alzheimer's, because I witnessed my mother, and she had Alzheimer's, and it lasted for many, many years, and it was the most difficult and painful experience that I had had up to that moment. And at one point in my life, this was about 10 years ago, I was terrified that I had Alzheimer's. Like, I literally thought that I had Alzheimer's. I was, I think, like 43 or 42 at the time. And I was like, I've got it. I know I have it. And I was so scared that I was almost provoking those symptoms in myself. So at one point, I was not, it was not a good moment in my life. And I remember one time I was swimming in a swimming pool, and I go underneath the water. And when I was submerged in the water, I was like, okay, Andrea, I start having this internal dialogue saying, okay, if you have Alzheimer's, let's say you have Alzheimer's, what are you going to do? And I said, well, a film. I'd like to be able to make a one last film before I disappear. And what kind of film would it be? Well, it would be a film to say goodbye to life, but I would want it to be a celebration of life and not a lament. Not a focusing on the illness, but rather on how wonderful life is. And so I started thinking about this film, and I was like, okay, yeah, that's a good plan. I'll make this film. But then I thought, okay, there's a contradiction in this idea, because I'll start to make the film, and at one point I won't know how to work the camera, or I won't know what I'm doing sitting in a chair in front of a camera, or I won't even know that my name is Andrea. And so I wouldn't be able to finish the film on my own, and I would need someone to help me make that film. So then I thought, okay, what kind of person would I want to help me make this film? Preferably a woman, and a woman who would share my philosophy of life, that she would be able to understand that I wanted to celebrate life and not just, cry about the situation. And I realized that I was projecting myself in both roles, in the woman that had Alzheimer's, and in the filmmaker that helps her to make the film. Fortunately, I did not make that documentary because I did not have Alzheimer's. But then I thought, okay, well, if it's not a documentary, let me make a fiction film. But I liked the idea. I liked the idea of a woman, of someone who has Alzheimer's, who would just, without being a professional filmmaker, how would she want to make a film, and how would she want to say goodbye to life? And so it automatically came into the realm of documentary filmmaking, even though it's a completely fiction film. But I wanted it to be very realistic in the sense that it was a documentary. So the form takes the form. Oh, it takes the form of a documentary, but in reality, it's a fiction film. So from the very, very beginning, it was, I was thinking of a documentary in my head, even though everything is created
Right.
outside of that.
It's very hard to tell, honestly. If you're not watching closely and if you haven't read the synopsis, you have no idea that this woman doesn't exist. I mean, I immediately went and Googled her and I said, oh, she doesn't exist. Okay. What was it about this storytelling, this approach that you then decided to take? What did it allow you to do in terms of filming it, shooting it, staging the scenes, deciding the editing rhythm?
Yeah. I mean, everything fell into the realm of, if this were a documentary, how would it be made? So
Hmm.
for example, the format, the actual format, what cameras we were going to use. For me, it was very important that we couldn't use like super professional cameras, because it wouldn't be realistic. And because not only the format of what you're seeing on, how the film is made, but you actually see the camera in mirrors and stuff. So I was like, the camera that we choose has to be a camera that would be realistic of this woman going out to a shop and buying a camera. It's not going to be very expensive. What would the camera of the filmmaker be? Well, this is not a huge filmmaker that has a huge production company. No, it's just her and her camera. So from what kind of equipment we used, to where the camera's placed. Like if we never have a shot of a camera, we don't have much coverage. Like we don't have very many takes of the same scene, because I was like, no, if she's shooting it, there's no coverage. There's no take one, take two, close up, medium shot, full shot. No, like it's going to go with one. Almost all the scenes are one take and one setup, except when we start playing with the two formats. So where the camera was placed was important to me. It was never going to be like up in a corner, this huge, shot of up in the corner of the room, because this woman would not put the camera up in the corner of her room. So where the camera's placed was always, it was a challenge. And it was one of those limitations that actually helps you to be more creative. The fact that we had to be limited to where and how the film was shot actually allowed us a lot of creative freedom. And what I loved also about it was that we played so much with the sound. The sound design of the film was everything like taking place off screen. We were able to play a lot with I love the idea of having shots where the camera is placed in a really weird place because she simply left the camera on the table. In a normal film, you would never do that. You would never have it, see people from the waist down. But I wanted to play with that. Like, okay, she just drops the camera somewhere, leaves it on the table. How would that be? And really, this scene takes place in the sound more than in the visuals. So it was very playful. It was a playful way of making a film. Also, of like, how can we have this scene where when I first meet Lena, my character, I was like, it's going to be mostly off screen. How can we have it's obviously the sound, it's the shadows in the background, it's Lena passes in front of the screen, but it's all just kind of exploring. It was a lot of exploration in it. And the same thing happened with the editing. How much we played with wanting people to think that it was a documentary, and at the same time, at one point allowing us the freedom of people will realize that it's not a documentary or not. Some people don't, but we did allow ourselves the freedom of like, okay, now it's the filmmaker that comes in. So the editing takes a different turn. We can be more, take more kind of aesthetic choices that if it were a true documentary would not happen. So I think it was a lot of fun and it was a lot of exploration, even though we had these limits, which were the limits of making a documentary.
So when you're watching personal documentaries, if this actually were a documentary, viewers believe that you're entering a character's life, her intimate zones, herself. You create a lot of, you generate a lot of empathy with this character because you feel, oh my God, this is really happening to this person. For a viewer who begins to realize that, okay, this woman is maybe not, she's not real in that sense, but she's a fictional construct. How do you maintain the balance and the empathy as a filmmaker to ensure that we continue with her journey, even after we've realized this?
I think for me, the way that I approach documentary filmmaking and fiction filmmaking is exactly the same. To me, it's all about story. It's all about constructing a story. Where's the drama? Where's the conflict? What is the character? How is the character multidimensional? Even, for example, in my second film, which was called Ciclo, it's a documentary about two brothers that make a bicycle trip from Mexico to Canada, which were my brother and my uncle. And I always use it as an example of how I had to construct the characters. My father and my uncle exist outside the film as people, but as characters, they're a construct. So in the film, I, as a documentary filmmaker, I'm constructing these characters. And so really it's all about the story. And I think in the moment when you tell a story, and you create empathy, whether it's documentary or fiction, to me, it doesn't matter. It's all about understanding. I mean, because ultimately fiction, there are fiction films that we watch that are absurd. Like it's not true. It's not a reality. And it doesn't matter. You still are caught up in it. You still empathize with the character, even though it's not true. So to me, there's not this concept of being true or not, or like true or false doesn't exist to me. It's totally irrelevant. To me, it's about yeah, it's about reaching people and touching people's hearts and, moving something inside them. And whether it's through documentary or fiction or this, which is kind of this mixture between the two, I think to me it's pretty irrelevant. Um, and I wanted to just to kind of mention something. A curious fact about this film is that the first time it was shown in a documentary, and I'm sorry, in a film festival, was in Los Cabos in 2019, and we won the audience award. And the audience was so like it was so touching, and afterwards, like even kids, like 16-year-old kids came up and asked Bea for an autograph and asked me, and they were so moved, and people of all ages, like it was a really wonderful experience. However, it's actually festival programmers that I feel don't understand. Like we haven't had, in terms of festivals, we've been rejected to so many because I feel like the festival programmers sometimes are the ones that don't understand it, whereas the spectator is like, yeah, whatever. Like they get caught up in it, and it doesn't matter. And that's to me what I think is wonderful. When somebody stops, like, it becomes irrelevant. It's simply this woman who's living the situation, and you empathize with her, and it touches you, and it makes you cry, or it makes you laugh, or whatever, and you leave the cinema, or in this case, your home, Zoom screen, being moved by that. And that's what I want to do as a filmmaker, is move people.
Right. So there's a lovely line in the film which says, when something drastic happens in life, women cut their hair. You mentioned about how autobiographical this film is. Could you tell us a little bit about your mother and how her story inspired the journey of this film?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the film is definitely inspired in my mother, even though she's not the character of Lena. She was not a writer. She was, Lena's best friend. So it's not so accurate in terms of the character, but definitely the spirit of Lena, who wanted to celebrate life. I learned that from my mother and my father, from both of them, because they were both very much about living life to its fullest and being very appreciative of life and grateful for everything that life gives you, and dealing also with pain and loss, and moving forward with that. Both my mother and father taught me that pain and loss and suffering is part of life, and you just have to, accept that. If you want to live fully, you have to accept that part of it as well. So definitely the movie was inspired by my mother. And I just want to tell you a little anecdote about that. My mother became ill with Alzheimer's a long time ago. She lasted a really, really long time. And it was just, I mean, for people who have experienced it, it's a horrible disease because the person transforms. My mother, who was a very sweet and gentle person, ended up being, I mean, a lot of the actual scenes from bird watching are scenes that I experienced with her. When Lena wants to leave the house and is screaming like a mad woman, that was my mother. And swearing, like the swearing, I was like, where is the swearing coming from? Because my mother never swore. She was just not that kind of person. And all of a sudden she's like, just like has a mouthful of words that I never heard her say before. So many of the scenes are actually based on scenes that I lived with my mother. But something happened that I always feel like, there's like life's little moments, or like these these gifts that life gives you. So my mother was very ill from, I think probably from when she first, like probably 2003, she was already showing symptoms of Alzheimer. And so she was 10 years in a home for the elderly. And the last 6 years of her life, she did not recognize me, like just nothing. I would go and visit her and it was like nothing, no reactions. She wouldn't look at me, no eye contact, just a very horrible way to live. My mother died the second week of the shoot. So we were shooting this film that is, originates from her, that is inspired by her. And that's when she dies. And I thought, I mean, of course it's, it's always painful, but at the same time, I thought it was so perfect. I was like, what a good moment to go. So we stopped the shoot for 2 days. I drove from this town where we were shooting to the town where she lived. It was like maybe a 4-hour drive. I go do all the, like the paperwork that I needed to do. And then I go back and I continue shooting. And the only thing that changed was that now my mother actually, like her photograph is part of Lena's photographs in her studio space. One of those photographs is my mother. So we just put a candle there, and we had a candle lit for her for the rest of the shoot. But then, when we were accepted in Los Cabos, Um, we ended up, my mother always loved whales. And she always said that in a previous life she had been a whale, and she always wanted to swim with whales. So in Bahia de Cortes, which is where Los Cabos is, we always had this plan of going so that my mother could see the whales, and we never did. So when I'm invited to Los Cabos, my mother had already died, and my sisters who live in Canada decided to come join me for the screening of the festival and to leave her ashes in the Bahia de Cortes with the whales. So we rent a boat. It wasn't really whale season, but we saw whales. So we see the whales. We drop the ashes in the ocean, and then the next night is the closing ceremony of the film festival, and we win the audience award. And the I have to show you this. The audience award
Oh
is a
my
whale.
God.
Isn't that
Wow.
perfect? That's just so perfect. Like
That's
those
a
are the kind of
sign.
things it
That's a
can't be more
sign.
perfect. Yeah, it was so perfect.
Yeah, in India we have this belief that when people die, the crows are sort of the carriers of the messengers between of souls. That if a crow comes to your window after somebody in your family's died, it means it could be that family member.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
what was your mother's name?
Jan.
Okay,
Jan Martinez. So the film is dedicated
right,
to my mother.
right.
At the end, there are
JM.
two
Yeah,
occasions.
yeah.
So the other thing that happened to me during the filming of not during the filming, it was actually in post production, was that my partner Jerry died while
Sorry
I
to
was in the editing process, and Jerry actually interprets the role of Henrik in the film.
hear.
So all of these flashbacks that Lena has about Henrik are actually Jerry, who was not an actor. I kind of forced him to be the love of, he was just like, oh, but Andrea, I'm not an actor. He was a chef. He's like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. And I was like, just look at the camera as if you're in love with who's behind the camera. And since you're in love with me, you won't have a problem. So Jerry, his last name was Moret. So both of them, their initials are both JM. So one of the dedications is to JM, my mother, and the other is to JM, Jerry, my partner.
So what's
So
making
it's
this
actually
film? I'm sorry.
no, tell me.
Was making this film cathartic in some way for you?
Oh,
At many levels?
definitely. Yeah. I mean, both in the process of shooting it, because also the decision for me to be in the film,
Mhm.
it wasn't a hard decision to take, because for me it was like from the very moment I was writing the screenplay, I knew that I was going to interpret the role of the filmmaker. Like it was never a question. So it was an easy decision to take. I didn't have to think about it. I was like, I have to do this film. But at the same time, I had never acted before. So, even though it's a role that is mostly off screen and it's mostly at the beginning, you just hear my voice, and then slowly I have to go more and more to the other side of the camera. But it was hard. It was hard for me to actually be in front of the camera. I wasn't used to being on the other side of the camera. So, and when I'm talking about the reason why I was able to act, it was because it was in a sense of catharsis. Like what I'm talking about is actually true. It's actually what I felt at that moment regarding my mother and the disappearance of my mother. So even though it's a character talking about Lena, in reality, it was me talking about my mother. So, I mean, that part was definitely cathartic in terms of the shoot. And then in post-production, when Jerry died, obviously, like at the beginning, the first time I actually saw by this time we had another editor, because I did the first cut of the film and then we had an editor come on board. So Francisco was actually the editor at that point. And, the first time I saw the film again and actually saw Jerry on the screen, obviously it was a very difficult thing to do. And my sister was here, and then the producer went with me, and my best friend went with me, and we were all like this whole team of people practically holding my hand to watch that first screening. And yeah, it was difficult, but at the same time, I was so grateful that Jerry is in the film, that that he's there forever. Like people will be able to know Jerry through my film and fall in love with him, just as I fell in love with him. And so when we showed the film in Los Cabos, then my sisters were there, my best friend was there, and again, it was like another catharsis. It was just like, it was wonderful, and it was such a lovely gift for me that I was able to make the film and have it on screen and then have people love the film. Also for me was just a wonderful experience both professionally as well as personally.
Right. And in a way that also sort of falls in with the very theme of the film and of the form of personal documentary, right? It is a kind of, people do this precisely so that you can freeze a moment in time forever. So yeah, it
Yeah,
fits in. Yeah.
yeah. And
So
just
tell
as,
us about, yeah.
Lena, no, I was just going to say, just as Lena is
Yeah.
celebrating life
Yeah.
within the context of a
Yeah.
horrible disease, I'm able to celebrate the life within the context of losing two of the people that I loved most in the world during that process. So there was a lot of parallel things going on
Yeah.
there.
So tell us about the actress who plays Lena. I believe she has never been in a movie before. So tell us
No,
about how you
yeah,
found her
oh
and
my God.
directed her.
That is wonderful. I had the idea that I didn't want a professional actress because I was like, okay, if I want to make a document, like a film that's supposed to be a documentary, and I have like a famous actress in it, then automatically you know that it's not a documentary. You
Yeah.
know it's a fiction.
Yeah.
So it was kind of that was partly the reason, and then the other part of the reason had to do with the schema of production. I wanted this to be a super small film in contrast to my two previous films. My first film was quite large, my documentary was quite large, and this I was like, no, I want it to be like minimal production, and everything to be super intimate. So I wanted so in that sense also it had to do with like, who do we like. I would love to work with somebody who's not a professional actress, but it was difficult to find that person because obviously to interpret a woman, if you're 60, 65 years old, and you're interpreting the role of somebody who has Alzheimer's, that's pretty close to home. Like it's something that can touch a lot of people at that age because you know that it's so possible. It's a possibility. So on two previous occasions, I was looking, while I was doing the development process of this film, which was several years, I had approached two different women. One was a German, another one was a Swiss woman. Because also I wanted them to be foreign because my mother was Canadian. So I did not want them, I wanted them to have a first language, preferably either English or French, which are the two languages I speak. And then to be able to speak Spanish, because for me, language was a really important element because it was fascinating to me to see how language in my mother started to transform and how she started to lose her Spanish. And in the end, I mean, well, she didn't speak, at one point she didn't understand or speak Spanish at all. And then she didn't understand or speak, she didn't speak English either. But at one point, it was really interesting to me to see how language, kind of the decadence of language. So I wanted the actress to be a foreigner who spoke Spanish. So I had approached these two women, and both of them seemed possible in terms of their personality. They seemed like a good fit, but both of them said no. They're just like, no way. Like, it's just way too terrifying to do something because they're not professional actors. Like, a professional actress knows that she's going to delve into a character, and that's her job. But if you're not a professional actor, then to interpret someone who has Alzheimer's is just way too difficult. So fortunately, both of them said no because Bea was, I think, just like the treasure of this film. I found her because there are certain communities here in Mexico where there are a lot of foreigners. They're like very lovely little towns, and so they attract a lot of foreigners for retirement. So Bea is French. She's been living in San Miguel de Allende for I think maybe 10 years or 15 years. And I found her through a mutual friend. I sent out this massive email, and a friend was like, oh, I'm going to send it out to all my contacts in San Miguel de Allende. So she sent it to Bea, received it. And from the moment I received the email from Bea, I was just like, Lena. Like, I knew it when I read the email because all of that energy, like that tremendous energy that Bea has on screen, that Lena has on screen is Bea. Like, that's who she is. So when in the email, she was just like, exclamation point, oh, I love this. Like, it was just, I could just feel the energy through the email. So I went to meet her, 4 days later. I drove the 2 hours to this town. And from the moment we met, we were just like, we have to do this. Like, we have to do. She was so into it. And she's like, and Andrea, if you want me to leave, but she would dye her hair. So she's like, if you want me to, not use dye and have my hair white, I have no problem with that. And I was like, yes, because that's precisely for me. That was really important, is that somebody who would allow themselves to kind of fall into decay. So it's physical as well as mental. And Bea completely, she just threw herself into it and did not have any issue. Like, she never said no to me. She knew, she was never like, oh, no, that's too much. No, she did not have. I think the main challenge with Bea is that she had done a bit of theater. And just her personality is so over the top that for me, it was constantly like like kind of limiting it, like, okay, less, give me less, give me less, not so dramatic, give me, lower tone. Because Bea is just so exuberant that for like the character is less, the character is a little bit more contained. So for me, the challenge was to contain Bea, to contain all that energy and have, so sometimes I would be like, with certain lines, I would be like, give it to me as if it was nothing. Like, don't put any emotion into it. And then she would do it. I was like, that's it. Like it's so perfect. But it was a joy to work with Bea, a challenge. I mean, it was a very much a challenge because it was a really challenging, emotionally, it was very challenging for everybody because you literally, like, we were 5 people on set. It was a very small crew, and the set was where her studio was. So it was like very intimate shoot. So the mental decay of this character ends up like permeating everything, and you actually feel that you're actually living it. So like, at the beginning, the shoot was very lighthearted. And at the end, it was just like there was a silence on set and everything was slow and heavy and, just charged with emotion. So, I mean, it was very challenging, but I think Bea just did such an outstanding job, that I just, I'm so moved when I see her, and I'm so grateful that she allowed herself, like she threw herself into it and just kind of exposed herself in that way.
Yeah. So, was it easy enough to raise funds, or was that a challenge?
It's actually really interesting, how kind of in terms of my career and also in terms of the moment that we're living now, what's happening in the world, how from going to this, very big budget, this is a poster for my first film with a very well-known star, and Guillermo del Toro, whom I'm sure a lot of was the executive producer. It was it wasn't a huge budget, but it was a pretty big budget, especially for my first film. Um, and my second film, Ciclo, even though it's a documentary and documentaries tend to be cheaper, like it was still pretty expensive because we were 15 people crossing the continent over 5 weeks. But for both of those films, we went through a tax, break, a tax, incentive here in Mexico. That basically like 80% of the funding came through that tax incentive. And so, it's a very kind of lengthy, so much paperwork to get those kind of, funds. It's like you have to put in the papers, and then it has to, it's like this big of a, book of all the paperwork that you have to do. And with bird watching, I was like, I don't want to do that, both for time reasons, because I didn't want to be waiting 2 years to get, the funding. And also for the schema of production. I was like, I wanted to be like, use as least amount of funds as possible. Like just make it ultra, ultra, ultra low budget. Which we were able to do because none of us charged any fees. The locations we got for free. I mean, it was mostly like food, and the equipment wasn't also very expensive. So what we did was we actually requested a grant for development, which is usually like where you get it at screen. Like, you just wrote the script, it's development. It's not for shooting, but we shot with it. Like we basically got this development, and we're like, okay, this is like 1/3 of what we need.
Right.
So we were able to get, it was not a very significant amount. So we were able to get it through the producer and through the state and a few other people. We were able to put the funds together. Yes. And then what we did was, with the first cut that I edited, then we requested funds for post-production. And we put a lot of money into post-production, which I think shows in the end, because like the sound design, the music, and the visuals are just stunning. Yeah. But that is, as you know, is a super expensive part of the process. So for that, that cost us like 5 times as much. And for that, we got state funds for it. Right. But it was a way of production that I completely fell in love with. I was just like, I love this. I love being 5 people on set. Right. It's so freeing, and it's so intimate, and it's so like you end up accomplishing so much more because you're not waiting for a crew of 25 people. Right. To be ready. It's kind of liberating. Okay. And so for my next film, which is called Tear, kind of coincidentally, I came up with a story with another actor that ends up being 2 characters. And so we decided, like, I was just like, I want to do it the same kind of way of like ultra low budget. For that, we did a crowdfunding, which is still ongoing. Right. But to me, I was just like, this is the way I want to make films. I mean, I do have other projects that are bigger, and that I will need to request state funds and a co-production with Canada. But for the time being, I just love this way of producing.
Right.
It's
Right.
yeah, I love it.
Sounds like fun. Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Andrea. This has been a lovely conversation,
Oh,
and
thank
I'm sure the audiences in Kerala are going to really like this film. And
you.
hopefully someday you'll make it there. Thank you.
Yes, I would love to make it there, and I hope everyone enjoyed the film. And I love the idea that a film can, make it all the way across the world and be seen by audiences everywhere. So thank you so much for watching the film, and thank
Thank
you
you.
for this interview.
Thank you.